So this is 13.3. This is our last video for political parties. So we've gone over the meaning of the party, the three-headed monster, ways to look at the party. We looked at the different historic eras and why we have a two-party system. So now that we have within that two-party system, what are the third parties looking like? What are the other components of the party system in America? And so as we mentioned before, this winner-take-all system, specifically in the presidential election, is what over time leads to a consistent two-party system. Now, this isn't the actual system, meaning it's not in the Constitution. Parties aren't even mentioned in the Constitution. And so de facto means it is in effect. This is how it works, although it is not official. De jure is by the law. The law does not dictate that we need a two-party system. But if you do the winner take all over time, it will kind of devolve into two parties dominating the conversation. We have a lot of unsuccessful political parties, parties where people run, they don't necessarily do well. I would say that throughout history, most of the third parties have been unsuccessful, but we're going to highlight some. And a lot of them are more successful when their ideas are co-opted. They're taken on by the major party. So think of environmentalism. Democrats don't really care about environmentalism. Green Party starts to steal voters away, and so the Democrats start to care more about environmentalism. And so, again, like I said, being co-opted. The other thing that we'll talk about is vote stealing, ticket stealing here. And so people will vote for the third party, which will steal away votes from the major candidates. And so the election of 1912 is a great example of this with the Bull Moose Party. Teddy Roosevelt, traditionally a Republican, and would be part of that two Republican era that we mentioned in the previous video. But ultimately, he did not win when he ran as a third party because it split the Republican vote, and then the Democrats end up winning. A couple of examples. Oftentimes, third parties are single issue. So one is the Temperance Party, so no alcohol, trying to ban alcohol in the United States. And to a certain degree, this party was successful. It became a constitutional amendment with the prohibition of alcohol. Another one, because a lot of the issues with slavery, looking at different ways to combat this issue. Ultimately, the Free Soilers were not abolitionists. They were really in favor of no slaves in the territories because the slaves would take away jobs that were opportunities for white males, farmers specifically. And so again, this is an anti-slavery party, but they're not really against the slavery so much as they're afraid that it'll lead to a loss of white jobs. Then what you have are the splinter groups. And when I say splinter, these are ones where they truly break off from a major party. So the Bull Moose Party is a great example in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt. So Bull Moose would be your progressives. Teddy Roosevelt as the trust buster, much more liberal than your moderate Republican Party, and sort of moves off to the left, and that would splinter the Republicans, and the Democrats would win that as well. After the Civil War, because we had the Northern and Southern Democrats, you do have the Solid South. And so the Dixiecrats would be Southern Democrats, pretty conservative. And so this is Governor George Wallace, definitely one of the Dixiecrats. So preventing integration into schools, standing in front of this door. This is also the scene in Forrest Gump, too. And then American Independent, very, very conservative, a lot of Judeo-Christian values. And so these splinter groups are claiming that as a part of the Republicans, it wasn't conservative enough. Same thing with the Dixiecrats. It's not enough emphasis on states' rights. And so these groups splinter off, break off from the major two parties. All right. And then the last thing we have here is third parties forming based off personalities. The Reform Party was created by Ross Perot. And this one really in the 80s and 90s is an idea of the Democrats and the Republicans, the two major parties, are not covering enough issues that Americans care for. So this is having a balanced budget, campaign finance reform, even term limits for House of Representatives and the Senate. And so, a lot of these things, these issues, and I think even they wanted like a holiday, for voting. Again, things that the major parties aren't covering, so a third party can step in and cover a lot of things that the people may care about. And a lot of times the ideas, specifically things like the Reform Party, will be co-opted by other parties. So what is the impact, right? When we look at third parties, I mean, it's not necessarily winning election, right? The impact of third parties isn't winning the election, but it is offering other things. So for example, safety valve for political discontent. So take the Green Party, Ralph Nader right here. Green Party steps in to talk about this idea of a minimum wage, of stepping in to improve the conditions of the environment. And so when the major parties don't cover things, third parties can step in and really be a voice for the people and carry that message forward where the major parties perhaps are ignoring it or not getting to it. New ideas come in too. This idea of having the election day off, I mean, that's a different idea than what the major parties are focusing on. And even with the environment, I gave it as an example too. A lot of these ideas will be brought into the conversation, and like I said, they will eventually be taken on. Third parties can also help frame the debate. They can help candidates that do not focus on all of the issues that the populace cares about. And so this can change things, specifically like with reform. You know, they want to get us out of things like NAFTA. And so when you frame the debate, then you bring to light issues that were not necessarily covered. So, I mean, I know I'm sounding repetitive, but this is the idea, is that the ideas are brought to the conversation of the major parties. And then this is kind of the negative component that people talk about with third parties is, do they just steal the votes away? If you're voting for the third party, you could steal away votes that would help a Democrat or would help a Republican. And I'll show you some examples with this, specifically with Ralph Nader, Pat Buchanan in Florida here. But some examples. So looking at the stealing of votes. So in 1912, you can see that, based on the Electoral College, I mean, Taft, he won Iowa and Vermont, and so the Electoral College, he didn't get much, even though his popular vote was much higher than Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt got more of the states in the Electoral College because of that. But you can just see that potentially, because those that voted for Teddy Roosevelt likely would have voted for Taft. And so, you do see Wilson kind of step in here because the people split their votes, not the Electoral College. This is, somewhat unrelated in this regard because it's just state by state, winner take all. But you can see that, the considerable number of people who voted for Teddy Roosevelt, Taft would have likely won. Then you get to the 90s. This is 92. So the incumbent, Herbert Walker Bush, running for re-election. The governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. And then this is Ross Perot here. So if you get 10% of the polling, then you can be in the presidential debate. Notice that in this 2020 election cycle, we don't have a third-party candidate included in these debates because the third-party candidates are not polling high enough, nor were they polling high enough in 2016 with the Libertarian and Green Party candidates. But that's why 92 was considered significant in that regard, because the third-party candidate was polling so high that they were allowed to be included in the debate. So that could be something to write down, is a difference of like a bias against third parties is Republicans and Democrats automatically get to be in the debate, but the third party, they got to work for it. They have to have at least 10% polling in a lot of places. Here you go, Ross Perot. Stealing votes, causing issues, or bringing things to the front of the agenda that perhaps are not being discussed. So here's the 92 popular vote. So you can see Perot taking away votes from that would likely go to Bush, right? Reform is a little bit more right. And so Clinton didn't win a majority of the popular vote in 92, still won the Electoral College, so he wins. But Clinton did not win the majority. Neither did he win the majority in 96 either. But you could see how Ross Perot, you could see this idea of stealing away votes from Bush, therefore Clinton wins. This is the Electoral College breakdown. So these are all the counties in the United States. And so you can see Ross Perot got, a few places here and there. But he never won any Electoral College votes because he didn't win any of the states. And so Ross Perot got 18.8% of the popular vote. But it was not enough to win any Electoral College seats. And if anything, perhaps took the vote away from Bush, allowing Clinton to win although Clinton votes did come into key states. And so you can also see the benefits of being a Southern Democrat, kind of flipping those seats as well. A couple more. So coming more to the 2000s, so I covered like the early 90s and then like the middle of the 90s. Now going into the 2000s, we bring up to the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore. Closest election, or at least one of the closest in American history. And a lot of it comes down to Florida. So if we look at this more specifically, George Bush won Florida by about 500 votes, 500. And so why? Why did this happen? Well, part of it is Ralph Nader got almost 100,000 votes. So had less people voted Green, perhaps George Bush would have won, or I guess in this case, because Ralph Nader, Green Party, much more left, they would have voted for Gore. Gore would have won Florida. Gore would have won Florida. He would have had enough for the Electoral College. He won. But that's not what happened. And so to bring in Pat Buchanan here, a reform candidate, because it comes down to counties, we had an issue of what's called the hanging chad, right? So if you watched How I Met Your Mother, I think Ted was like a hanging chad. But if you look very closely, so how it would work is you prick out like a perforated square, and so 3 goes to this candidate here. 4, which one is it? Is it this hole right here? Is 5 this hole right here? So in Palm Beach County, what happened is many people pricked this hole, but the people at the polls couldn't tell, is this a vote for Pat Buchanan or is this a vote for Al Gore? And so what we see is the only place where the hanging chad was like unclear, and hanging chad is where you poke the box but it doesn't completely fall off, and which number is it actually? So Pat Buchanan got over 3,000 votes in Palm Beach. And it came to the Supreme Court. Should we recount those in Palm Beach? And the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to recount them. And so essentially, George Bush wins by 500 votes. 3,000 of Pat Buchanan's votes came from Palm County because of a ballot confusion issue, and so hotly contested. But, so George Bush wins here. And so you can see how razor thin this can be, but also the impact of third-party candidates, and this is one of the best examples, I think, of vote stealing, other than the 1912 and then 1992 election. And then here's just some, third-party candidates. Joe Lieberman, who, was a self-proclaimed conservative Democrat, and then eventually became Republican, now is independent. And then Bernie Sanders, who ran as president as a Democrat, really is an independent democratic socialist. So last couple things. So when you talk about why third parties fail, part of it is ballot access law. So what this means is that Republicans and Democrats, they get on the ballot automatically. But if you're a Green Party or you're a Reform Party, you have to fill out a bunch of paperwork, and so you even have to have a certain polling number to even be put on the ballot. So that's potentially an unfair advantage for the two parties. So here's some examples. So in Alabama, new party or statewide independent candidate, you need to petition with at least 3% of the last gubernatorial vote. So you need to have enough people interested signing your petition that is related to what the governor vote is. So it says that no one has managed to do this since 97, except the Libertarians in 2000. And it says, furthermore, if a party goes on, it needs to poll at least 20% of the vote for any statewide office to stay on. So if you want to stay on, it's very unlikely that you would have the numbers to support that. All of these hoops, the Democrats and Republicans don't have to do that in Alabama, only third parties. Then in Pennsylvania, it says you have to have a membership of at least 15% of the registration to remain on the ballot. So if people don't vote for your party, or if you're trying to make a new party, it's very unlikely you could even start to get on the ballot here. And it says if this Pennsylvania law were in effect in Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., or Massachusetts, Republicans wouldn't be on the ballot. Because Republicans in those states don't make up 15% of registered voters. They're all Democrats in those states. Like D.C. has never voted for a Republican candidate for president. So, again, I guess my point is that if this were, the major parties, they would not be on these ballots. And if we're the Democrats, Idaho and Utah, there's less than 50% of registered voters as Democrats, so they wouldn't be on the ballot. So again, just showing an unfair advantage to the third parties. And then the last one, very tolerant ballot access for every type of candidate, doesn't require any petition, with the sole exception of an independent presidential candidate who needs signatures. So Florida, go for it. They're very open to the third parties, and this would also explain why things were so close in that 2000 election, because it was so much more open to third parties than other states were. So those are ballot access laws, state to state, because voting is largely a state issue. The other thing I mentioned with like Ross Perot, the fact that Ross Perot got to be on the debate is a big deal and not something that we normally see, because you have to have at least usually 10% of the polling. And then another reason why third parties fail is their whole reason for existence. Usually their platform gets stolen by the major parties. So I mentioned environmentalism with the Democratic Party. The Green Party's goals are not as necessary if Biden is proposing a framework similar to the Green New Deal. Right. And that's everything for third parties. This kind of wraps it up. First video defining what parties are. Second video about the two-party system and also about the party eras to show that historically. And then this one about third parties. If you can break up your understanding of political parties into those three sections, you're good to go.